So I'd like to thank you all for coming today. I know that you love training just as much as I do, and this particular topic is so invigorating and enthralling. I'm sure you just can't wait to dive in. But I would like to say thank you for taking the time, because it is a very important topic for the city of Greenville and all local governments, to be exact, because as we know, anytime you're a steward to federal dollars, you have to be able to dispense or disperse those dollars in a manner that coincides or complies with how the federal government would like it dispersed. So this particular training is designed to help you understand a new protocol called Uniform Guidance. Uniform Guidance is what the federal government actually passed back in 2014. At that time period, they put in play uniform protocols for the spending of those federal dollars. It also looks at audit requirements. It looks at cost principles. So procurement is just one part of the uniform guidance. But today we're just going to focus on procurement. So because you either directly or indirectly spend those dollars, you are a very important part of the city of Greenville's compliance with this UG policy. So purchasing is here to help you comply. We will do all that we can to make sure that the city of Greenville is in compliance. And this particular training is going to kind of break it down to some nuts and bolts, so you can look at exactly what we're going to be requesting when you put it in the requisition system or when you put it in contracts, the attachments and the paperwork that we're going to be looking for. Also, any of the sourcing requirements that you have before it even gets to that requisition point. When you go request for quotes and when you solicit bids, all of those particular protocols we're going to discuss today. We do understand that uniform guidance is something that is just that, uniform, that cuts across all of your federal agencies, but some of your federal agencies are also going to have additional requirements that you will also have to meet. So please understand that UG is not a once and for all. Yes, all federal granting programs require compliance with this, but again, there may be additional requirements that you also have to meet. So be certain that you are meeting those requirements as well. Thank you, Lamont. If there's anyone that does not have a procurement manual, Lamont has a copy for you. Very good. Thank you so much. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I also wanted to make sure that this was an interactive presentation, so at any time you have questions, please stop me and we can entertain those questions. I know you guys have a lot of experience with federal grant programs, so I would like for this to be an opportunity where we can share best practices, share our experiences, and hopefully gain knowledge from each other as well as from the presentation. All right? So what is uniform guidance? Uniform guidance, commonly known as UG, are a set of rules and standards that the federal government has put in play for the expenditure of federal financial assistance, which includes both grants and loans. It is something that will supersede any previous rules before the December 2014 ruling. So anything else coming from the Office of Management and Budget prior to that time, this UG guidance now supersedes. As I mentioned earlier, UG covers audit, it covers cost principles, it covers all things concerning your federal grants, but we're focusing on subpart D, which focuses primarily on your procurement standards. So who does the UG apply to? The UG applies to basically everyone except the federal government, so your non-federal entities. Any that receive federal financial assistance, including your states, nonprofits, your Indian tribes, your universities, and of course your colleges, and of course your local governments, so cities and counties, school districts, so on and so forth. And I would like to reiterate that it's direct and indirect spend. So if any of our divisions here also provide federal dollars to your nonprofits or to your subrecipients and even your subcontractors, there are certain parts of UG that will apply to your subcontractors as well. But just in general, those that are dispersing funds, they too, if you're dispersing funds to those agencies, they too must follow the UG guidelines. And again, these are all your non-federal entities, so things, agencies that come to mind or come to bear would be FEMA, USDA, your CDBG, your HUD, your EPA. the whole gamut. There may be some programs where the UG requirements do not apply, but we always make the assumption that they do unless they tell us otherwise. So why is this training important? This training is extremely important because non-compliance has very serious consequences. Non-compliance can be anything up and including deobligation. So the City of Greenville does not want to be in a situation where we lose our federal funding because of non-compliance with these procurement requirements. So it is very, very important that we attend this training and follow this training through. Just to give you a few statistics, between the years of 2009 and 2014, around $387 million was deobligated. So that means this is a real thing. Sometimes individuals may think, oh, it won't happen to us. It can't be that bad. We'll make it up on the back end. We'll ask for forgiveness later. We've heard that before, right? But we want to make sure that we do it right on the front end of our procurement. We know in 2015 alone, $122 million was disallowed or deobligated. So again, the City of Greenville does not want to be in a situation where we have to give up our federal funds. And actually, non-compliance with procurement is the number one reason why funds are deobligated. So it's a very, very important component. Please pay attention to or make note of the note at the bottom of the slide. The city department that receives the federal funding is responsible for ensuring compliance with UG and other grant requirements. Again, the purchasing division is making you aware of the UG requirements, but as we stated at the beginning of the presentation, there may be requirements specific to your particular grant that the purchasing division may not be aware of. So all of those details and all of that information that you receive with your notice of funding, the city department that receives the funding is responsible for that compliance. So let's dig into it. We're going to be looking at pages 3 through 5 of your procurement manual if you'd like to follow along. Here we're going to be looking at the top 7 general procurement standards. Now, looking at your manual, there are more than 7. So what I have done is kind of collapsed some of the standards that we can do, that we can collapse. So we have our top 7 general procurement standards. And these are the following standards that apply anytime you're spending federal dollars. Number 1, contract award. All contracts are to be awarded to the lowest responsible bidder, possessing the ability to perform successfully under the terms and conditions of the contract. This is a phrase that we all should be familiar with already because it is the same award standard, substantially the same award standard as the state and our local policies. So when we look at the lowest responsible bidder, we know responsiveness means did they respond to the bid as required. So if we stated that the bid has to be returned to the purchasing division by 3 p.m. on Tuesday, did they turn it in at 3 p.m.? If they turned it in at 3:01, we know that means the bid is non-responsive, and we know that means we cannot accept their bid. If we state in the bid that you must include your non-collusion affidavit and it must be notarized, if that was not done correctly or if it was not done at all, we know that bid is unresponsive. So we in turn must reject the bid. So responsiveness is the first criteria that we look at. And then, of course, we're looking at responsibility. Responsibility goes into the latter part of that statement. Do they possess the ability to perform successfully the contract? So if we ask for a red building with 4 walls and a tin roof, do they have the ability to perform that contract? Are they a general contractor? Have they performed similar contracts with other agencies successfully? So that's the purpose of doing your reference check and doing your check on your financials. All of that goes into your award standard. Also with UG requirements, we know that we cannot award to federally debarred vendors. So we're requiring all individuals before they submit a requisition, before you enter a contract, to also make certain that the vendor is not debarred. This also includes subcontractors for your construction contracts. So if you have a contract that has subcontractors listed and you know will be performing on the job, they too must also not be federally debarred. Are there any questions about that?
Is that
Yes.
available? I mean, the list, how is that available?
Absolutely. The list is available through sam.gov. That is an online database where you can check the system to see if your firm is listed. And there's also examples, or there's also instructions concerning that in the procedure section of the manual that we'll go over shortly. Yes, sir.
Couple of questions.
Absolutely.
Historically, in our contracts, we have included an affidavit that's a non-collusion affidavit, debarment certification that the prime contractor or bidder must sign whenever they submit their bid.
Mm-hmm.
So is this going to invalidate that and make that no longer valid as a means of verification?
I don't believe it makes it invalid, but what I do believe is the onus is still on the government or the agency that received the funds to ensure that you're not doing business with a debarred vendor. It's kind of similar to Iran divestment certification. At one time, we did have that certification document, but the onus was still on the individual government not to do business with a business that was on that list. So in order for us to meet that criteria, we do need to do the SAM search, but an additional safeguard of that certification is absolutely fine. So to answer your question, when it comes into the requisition system, we do want to see that SAM search.
Okay. So it sounds like that, I mean, really that's unnecessary then, because I think historically we've leaned on that to protect the city. To say, well, the bidder supplied a signed affidavit that was notarized that said that they were not on the, they were not a debarred company. So if we still have to check that, it's really kind of a moot point.
It's an additional safeguard, and I'm all about safeguards. So I think, I wouldn't change your procedure, but I would say add a new procedure or process if you haven't been doing it in the past.
Right, okay. Second question, relative to subcontractors. Most of the time, we do not know who those subcontractors are whenever we open bids. We don't have any type of list that's provided. They have a certain amount of time after execution of the contract to, really after award and execution of the contract, to then sign subcontracts with their subcontractors. So quite often at the time of contract execution, we don't know who those subcontractors or suppliers may be. So there's not going to be a way, or there's going to be a lapse in time before we're actually able to verify that, at which time we've already executed a contract with the prime contractor. So how are we going to handle that?
So that's a great question. So I'm thinking back to our formal bids. Of course, on our formal bids, we're going to require a listing of your MWBEs.
Right.
So your MWBEs, we can certainly verify those. And I'm sure Ferdinand wouldn't mind adding that to his list of due diligence duties. So when we think about our MWBE firms, we know that they will be listed.
Right.
I'm also thinking about your formal building construction. Are there opportunities for them to list the subcontractors that are doing like your HVAC, your plumbing, and things of that nature? Do they list that at a certain dollar amount?
I would have to.
I don't think so.
I don't actually deal with vertical.
Okay.
So I'll have to look at some.
Okay.
I don't recall it.
Okay, let's do some more research and let's brainstorm that together, because we're going to comply to the extent that we can, essentially. And if it's something that we do have to do after the fact, then we'll do it after the fact just to make sure we have that documentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you could basically, if they submit a debarred vendor, we could disallow their use
Of that subcontractor.
of that subcontractor. I guess at that point.
That makes sense. Okay. Thanks, Scott.
Just a little thing.
Yeah.
I said just a little update in the contract.
Yeah.
Very good. Great conversation. Thank you. And so the requesting department must prepare a written contract. Most of you do this already, so you're already ahead of the game on that. And as such, all of your contracts must be approved through the requisition or the contracts module. So what we're stating is no P-card purchases will be allowed when you're expending federal funds. Okay? Yes, sir.
I guess just due to staffing constraints, we sort of jointly develop our contracts with whoever the selected consultant is. Most of ours are service contracts as opposed to construction contracts. That doesn't necessarily contradict that, correct?
It does
Provide
not.
all the language that we require as part of that, but most of the time we have the consultant say draft the actual contract itself and then submit it for review through our
Absolutely.
channel. So that's still
That's
allowed.
perfectly
Okay.
fine. As long as the appropriate contract provisions are included, the appropriate language is included, that's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Okay? Any questions on written contracts, additional questions on written contracts, or no P-card purchases? Okay? When you're entering your contracts into the requisition system or to the contracts module, we are asking you to perform this stopgap measure, which is to include in your general notes section, to include that this is a federally funded purchase, and then include the awarding agency that the funds are coming from. So if it's DOJ, NCDOT, CDBG Home, what have you, make sure that you include that is a federally funded purchase and the particular awarding agency. So I, as the reviewer of that requisition or that contract, will know that I need to be looking at this from the lens of uniform guidance. That will help us out a great deal. We are working with IT to create some more protocols within the system so that we can adjust our workflow for federally funded contracts. But until such date, we are asking everyone to please add this additional step to your requisition and contracts entry.
I don't need to be the.
Absolutely.
Another quick question on
Yes.
my part. Our funds are actually funneled through the state, so they may be federal funds, but the state is actually the ones that issue them.
So they're
I guess
passed
we would
through.
Still,
Yes.
yeah, so we would still say, for mine, FHWA would still be the
Mm-hmm.
administrating agency, even though DOT is actually who we receive the money from.
I would put both.
Both of them.
I would put both. Thank you. That's a great question. The second general procurement protocol that will apply to all of your federal funds is necessity. What we're saying here is that we are to avoid unnecessary or duplicative supplies and services and limit your acquisitions only to what is necessary to perform the work. So what does that mean? You see the generators here at the bottom, and all my public works folks already knew that off top. I didn't have to explain that. But yes, you have 3 generators here. So what this particular protocol is stating is if you have enough money to buy 3 generators, but you only need 1, the federal government is not going to allow you to buy the additional 2 and stockpile it for a rainy day. They're saying that we want you to be sure that you're only purchasing what you need to purchase. Also within your manual, there is a note about the federal surplus supply. And I would like to bring that to your attention because UG also mentions utilizing any of your surplus property opportunities. If you don't have to purchase it outright and you can use surplus property, they're encouraging you to do that. Federal surplus supply is something that does have to go through either the purchasing department or division. The city manager's office and fleet also has the authority, if you will, to go make purchases from that federal supply in Raleigh. So if you have a request, please let us know and we'd be happy to facilitate that for you.
Question about that. If you have a contractor that I guess necessitates a duplicate, let's say it's a pump, as a standby,
Okay.
is that allowed under this?
If it can be justified, and let's say you don't want to be in a situation where one generator stops working or one pump stops working and you be in a catastrophic situation,
Right.
absolutely, I think that can be justified. Next, All of your bid solicitations must include a notice of federal funding. So you must let your contractors know that this is a federal contract, a federally funded contract. So there must be an acknowledgement within your language for your bid. Also, all the bidders or offerers must acknowledge that funding is contingent upon compliance with terms and conditions, and also they must comply with all federal laws. So the sample language that you see at the bottom of the slide is verbatim what you can put in your contract and be in compliance with number 3. So please keep in mind, all of your solicitations must include this language or substantially similar language to comply with this protocol. Absolutely.
Will this PowerPoint be made available?
Absolutely.
After you?
It will be made available after this presentation. We're going to post it on Cognet, so you'll be good to go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's the assumption on, we deal with the NCDOT quite frequently. Do we just automatically make the assumption that there's federal funds involved with NCDOT and have this notice included?
Yes, sir.
Because sometimes we may not know exactly what their funding profile.
Understood. Understood. This is not something that I've seen the city of Greenville do, but I just wanted to make you aware UG guidance does not allow time and materials and cost plus contracts. So they're generally not allowed. Time and materials contracts, of course, you guys are familiar with. Who would like to explain what a time and materials contract is? So time and materials, you're looking at what your labor costs are and what your material costs are. And you're saying you're entering into a contract not knowing what the total contract amount is. You're basically entering into the contract saying, I'll pay you however much it costs in labor and materials. So it really puts the city of Greenville in a situation where we can't encumber those funds or pre-audit those funds. However, if there is a not to exceed amount on the contract, then that then becomes something that we can encumber and pre-audit. So, yes, absolutely.
I'm gonna have lots of questions.
I love it.
Typically on our NCDOT projects, obviously when we award the contract, it is a fixed price contract based on unit prices. We do sometimes run into situations where we have change orders during construction. And if we cannot agree with the contractor on a price to perform that work, then the NCDOT specifications provide for that to be done via force account, which is basically time and materials. You track every piece of equipment, every laborer, every foreman, every supervisor, while that work's being performed. And then there is a set price associated with each of those. And in that situation, you don't necessarily know what the price is going to be, but the DOT specifications allow for that as a change order in the contract. So
Absolutely.
how is that going to be?
That's a great question.
addressed?
Great question. And that's why the language or the guidance says generally not allowed. In those particular situations, obviously NCDOT has said that it is allowed. So we will follow NCDOT's regulations and guidelines there because it is an exception, if you will.
Okay.
Even within the confines though of a unit price contract, I mean, we do an estimate of it's a unit price contract, we do an estimate of the quantities, but our estimate gives a total at the end, as a base bid, if you would. I mean, but if there's more material used or more units used in a particular contract, then you go for a change order.
That's right.
But that though is still a little bit different than the time and materials though.
Yeah.
Because you've got a unit price to say the contract calls for 100 feet of 15-inch pipe and you end up using 116 feet.
Right.
And that's still, you've got a unit price that you're working from.
Right, you got a unit price, it just that you're gonna exceed, or you may exceed or actually bid less than contracted.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But that's still within the confines of what is allowed under UG. So you should be fine there. Documentation, documentation, documentation. So there's a common phrase that says, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And with uniform guidance and with federal procurement in general, that is never more true, because we are required to provide a detailed written record of procurement so that we can document every phase of the procurement process. Sometimes we think, well, if I document the end, this is the awarded contractor, this is how much we're going to pay this contractor, then we've done all we need to do. But with uniform guidance, we have to start at the very beginning on what we call the procurement planning stage. So even when you're thinking about doing this type of procurement, we need to start documenting that process. Some of the things that we need to document is the rationale for the method of procurement. Why are we deciding to do it as a request for quote? Why are we deciding to make this a small purchase versus a micro purchase? All of those things we have to be able to document and show within the system. Also, the contract type. We, of course, do fixed price contracts, and the other contract types are generally disallowed. So we have to document that this is a fixed price contract. The contractor selection process. How can we document that we have certainly followed the contract award standard of awarding to the lowest responsible bidder? We have to document that we did just that. Can we document responsiveness? Can we document responsibility? Basis for contract price. If we're doing a micro purchase, is it because we've looked at a catalog listing and we see that this price is fair and reasonable? Is it because we've purchased this widget before, so we absolutely know that this is a good price for this particular good or service? All of these things we need to document, and as we go into the procedures portion of this presentation, there will be sample forms that we will use to document each of these processes. Another thing I wanted to bring to bear is that a lot of times documentation can be done, but perhaps it's not done in a centralized way. So sometimes when folks move or when folks move up, that documentation kind of gets lost, if you will. So what we're trying to do now is make sure that all documentation is centralized in our ERP system. That's why we are requesting that you include a number of attachments with all of your contracts and with all of your requisitions. You all are already doing this, but wanted to bring to bear that UG also requires us to have contractor oversight. What that means is that we must maintain oversight to ensure that the contractors perform according to the terms and conditions and specifications of the contract. So we have to make sure that they're doing what they agreed to do in the contract. Our last and final procurement protocol is open competition, and this is something that our local government policies encourage, our state policies encourage, and now federal policy is encouraging in writing. Full and open competition. That means that there is an equal opportunity for all bidders to compete in the contract, and we are not providing any sort of prohibition or any sort of restriction that would limit the number of contractors that can participate in the process. So that is something that comes into play when we think about MWBE firms, when we think about not using brand name specifications, making sure that if we do, we have an or equal clause, so we can make sure we're not constricting the number of bidders that can participate. That means that our local preference policy does not apply, and we know local preference already doesn't apply for anything over 30,000, but when it comes to federal contracts from 0 to jabillion, geographic preference does not apply or is prohibited. We also understand that designers and contractors under the federal guidelines, if they assist you in completing your specifications, they cannot bid on the contract. That is something that we may not have seen before, but under UG guidelines, if a designer or a contractor assists you in developing your specifications, they cannot participate in the bid. So please bear that in mind when you're thinking about reaching out to firms to get some assistance with your technical specs. Also, pre-position contracts are permitted, and I would say even encouraged. When we think about our debris removal and debris monitoring contracts, we may or may not engage those contracts. The City of Greenville did not engage its debris monitoring or its debris removal contract over the past 3 years, but we've entered into another solicitation process and are getting ready to execute a contract for debris removal and debris monitoring because we want to be ready in case of an emergency. So having those pre-position contracts already competitively bid and in place is something that is permitted and I would state encouraged. Any questions on any of those? Yes, sir.
On the designers contractors who help develop specs, in the realm of pre-manufactured bridges,
Okay.
there is a designer slash supplier that a lot of the consulting firms will go to help develop specifications or that are included in, say, a greenway plan for a pedestrian bridge or as an example. But when it's included in the contract and the plans, it's referenced with the specifications, and then it's provided, or equal, as to be provided by the prime contractor. That company or those companies do not bid as a prime contractor on those projects. But am I understanding this to say that they are not allowed to bid as a subcontractor or a supplier through a prime contractor?
I don't believe that is what we're stating here, but we can certainly delve into that a little bit more because I think that is kind of a unique situation. And I would say that we would need to delve in that to a little bit more and also contact our granting agency. Because if our granting agency gives us the permission to move forward with that, then certainly we can move forward with that. But that may be something you want to contact your individual granting agency about. Yeah.
We could
That's a
be
great question.
Talking about seeing at risk, design build, and normal design bid build as part of the procurement process.
We actually won't be talking about it specifically, but I will go ahead and tell you that that comes under the RFP process and not the construction kind of hard bid process. So when you see me go through the competitive proposal procedure, that's the procedure you'll use for CM at risk and those type contracts. Okay. Great. Thank you guys for being so interactive. Any additional questions? Very good. I also wanted to go over briefly your standards of conduct. That is located at the end of your procurement manual on pages 16 through 19. These standards of conduct apply to all of your federal contract solicitations. And you're already familiar with this. We have a similar local and state policy. We know that no employee, officer, or agent of the grantee shall participate in the selection or in the award or administration of a contract if a conflict of interest exists. And that conflict can be either real or apparent. So if there seems to be a conflict, that means you also must disclose that conflict to myself, to the city attorney, and your federal granting agency. Anyone that's in violation of any of these standards of conduct will be subject to discipline up to and including termination. So it's a very, very serious matter. And if any of these conflicts possibly exist, please don't hesitate to disclose. Also understand that you cannot solicit or accept gifts or favors. There are a few narrow instances where you may be able to accept a very small nominal gift from a contractor or firm, which would include things like promotional products that you get at Christmas. Maybe even possibly a small honorarium, but I would strongly advise against that as well, because that could have an appearance of a conflict that we don't want to engage in. And the conflict of interest policy that we handed out at the beginning of the session will go into more detail about that conflict of interest. And we will ask you again at the end of the session to please sign that you have both read, acknowledged, and agreed to comply with that conflict of interest policy. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to ask them. So now we get a chance to get into the nuts and bolts of things. A lot of times folks, when they think about UG, they think about it as an additional layer on the processes and procedures that they're already doing. And you're exactly right to think that way. Let's read this quote here. It says, the non-federal entity must use its own document procurement procedures which reflect applicable state, local, and tribal laws and regulations. So at the beginning of this procurement manual, it states, this manual must be read in conjunction with the existing city's procurement manual. So those two are not mutually exclusive, provided that the procurements conform to applicable federal law and the standards identified in this part. So what does that mean? That means that there are instances where you will have to comply with federal law because it trumps state law. There will be times where you have to comply with both state and federal. And there are times when you will have to make a case-by-case judgment on that. But in general, we go with the applicable state, local, or federal law that is the most restrictive. And by most restrictive, we mean the one that requires us to do the most work, the one that has the most limitations. So keep that in mind as we're going through this process. So when we look at the different regulations and laws that we must follow, there's some major differences between the federal guidelines and the state guidelines. We have them listed here. Bid thresholds are going to be different. Some of your bidding requirements are going to be different. We know that on the state and local side, service contracts are exempt. No procurement requirements are associated with both your state or your local contracts. But in practice, we know on a local level, we handle a lot of our service contracts as if they were under the bid law. But according to the federal government, they're absolutely under UG, and there are bidding requirements for service contracts. Your minority solicitation requirements, there are some different requirements between the state and UG, but you're extremely fortunate to be working for the city of Greenville because our local policies are restrictive enough such that if you follow our local policies, you will meet the UG requirements. Exciting, huh? Also, we've already talked about your time and material cost plus contracts. There are some bidding exception rules. Those will be your sole sources. Of course, we are required to have written policies and documentation. Your contract provisions are going to be different for your federal solicitations. Again, we've already gone over your conflict of interest policy. And then when we think about our subrecipients or the nonprofits that we have pass-through funds that go to, yes, they must follow UG. For the next few slides, we're going to go over items 1 through 4 and number 7. But let's do a quick overview. I know a lot of you have taken the School of Government courses, so this particular chart is very familiar to you, but I would like to give you a quick refresher on what the state laws are. You see here under the purchase side, there is a free space when we look at the cost of the contract between $0 and less than $30,000. No procurement law is required. We have to follow our local policy. When you get into the threshold of between 30 and 90,000, we understand that your informal bid limit comes into play. And then above 90,000, we know we go into our formal bid limit. So that means that we have sealed bids, advertised for a certain number of days, must be publicly advertised. On the construction side of the house, again, you have a free space between 0 and less than 30,000. We understand that we follow our local policy at that point. That includes things like local preference. Between 30 and 500,000, we go into the informal range. Of course, we have some additional rules that hit at the $300,000 mark. But then when you get above $500,000, you're in the formal bidding range. Again, publicly advertised, you receive sealed bids, minimum number of bids. For your qualifications-based selections process, that's your Minnie Brooks Act purchases. That's for your design services, your architectural, your engineering services. And then you have everything else, free space. If we were to look at UG, the chart changes just a bit. As you can see, there's no free space. All of your purchases must follow some particular regs or guidelines. So between 0 and less than 10,000, it is considered a micro purchase. Now we're very fortunate because that threshold was recently upgraded. It used to be 3,500. So now we're up to 10,000. Between the $10,000 mark and the $250,000 mark, those are considered small purchases. Your $250,000 mark is your simplified acquisition threshold. Again, that was increased. It was at one point $150,000. So that kind of relieves some of the administrative burden for us as a local government. And then above that range, when we look at purchases and services, we can either procure those items using the sealed bid process. If the sealed bid process is not appropriate, then we can go to our RFP process. Under the construction category of work, we can again use sealed bid or your RFP process. And Scott, that's where we go into our CM at risk and our design build. Then under your architectural engineering services, anything that goes above your $250,000 mark becomes your qualifications-based selections process. This is only concerning UG. So what we have not considered is your state requirements that we also must meet. So let's see what that looks like. We've talked about that a little bit, about which set of rules do I follow. You're going to follow the most restrictive rules. So let's take a look at what the most restrictive rules are when we go through this chart. And this chart is going to be very handy when you start entering to your procurements to kind of figure out where your procurement lands. So if we were just to follow the state guidelines for the purchase of goods and services, we would follow arrow number 1. If we were just going to follow the UG guidelines, we'd follow arrow number 2. The last arrow is your most restrictive, so that's the guideline that we're required to follow. We will have our micro purchases, but instead of looking at your formal bid level at just the $250,000 level, which UG requires, we're going to look at the $90,000 level because that is the most restrictive when looking at the state requirement. So that just kind of gives you an example of what it means to be most restrictive. Does that make sense to everyone? Now this is for construction and repair. For construction and repair, if we were just going to follow the state guidelines, again, we'd have that free space there, less than 30,000. Then we go into our informal and formal bid range. If we were just going to follow UG, we'd have that micro purchase. Then we move into our small purchase, and above 250, we would go into either our sealed bid or RFP process. However, because we're going to the most restrictive, we're going to look at the last arrow, which we see that the sealed bid process, the formal bidding process, is going to start at $250,000, and we are going to move up from there. As we go through the individual procedures, we'll have an opportunity to kind of tease out some of those scenarios and what they look like. And let's do that now. If you're following along on your procurement manual, we have the opportunity to take a look at some of these procedures precisely. And we're looking at service contracts with the exception of A&E, and also purchase and construction contracts less than $10,000, so that's in the micro purchase range. And that starts on page 7 of your procurement manual. So when we're in the micro purchase range, this is a pretty simple procurement process, if you will. We have the opportunity to award the contract without soliciting pricing or bids. as long as we can determine that the bid price is fair and reasonable. This is a great opportunity for us to use our MWBE firms. To the extent practicable, and this is what the guidance states explicitly, we should attempt to distribute among qualified firms. And when they say distribute among qualified firms, they mean, distribute it to those firms who may not get the opportunity in an open bid situation. So again, those are your MWBEs. Your procurement record must include and or attach to the requisition your method of procurement decision matrix, and you'll see the document number there. In the actual procurement manual, if you view it online, that document number will be hyperlinked, so it'll automatically open up that document in DM. You also must include a copy of your quote. If you have multiple quotes, great, include multiple. Your price reasonableness determination form, which will give some documentation to say that, yes, I know that this price is fair and reasonable because A, I've bought it before, B, I'm familiar with this industry and I am aware that this price is fair and reasonable, so on and so forth. And again, we are asking you to go to sam.gov and do your federal debarred search, if you will, to ensure that the vendor that we're doing business with is not debarred. So that screenshot is to be included with your requisition. Anytime you see that blue star, that's something that we're going to pay particular attention to because it is a procedure. So if you need a checklist or a cheat sheet, this is where you go.
So question then. Two-part question. One,
Sure.
What's more restrictive, I guess, the service contracts or the A&E contracts?
A&E.
So ours sort of can fall into either or, so I guess
Yeah, they do.
A&E are more restrictive, so we would wish to, I guess, follow those ones?
I would believe so. In working with you and with DOT, they tend to be more restrictive anyway.
Yeah.
So I would say, yeah, the more
Okay.
restrictive.
And then second part is we're in contract negotiation for a couple right now already, so do I need to go back and include all this information already? Okay.
Yes. Please do. Any requisition that has not hit my desk, yes.
Okay.
Question.
Yes.
So, for example, if we have a contractor that is replacing wheelchair ramps around town, and we encounter a situation where we need to remove a tree, so we solicit a quote from a contractor that's say $5,000. Does that fall under this?
Yes.
Okay.
Because that's a separate contract with a separate vendor.
Right. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
What tree are you trying to kill?
Is that relative even though it's not paid with federal funds?
Is it going to be paid with federal funds?
That'll be our own,
I don't think that one.
no.
Okay, then no, this doesn't
Any of
apply.
those,
Typically, they're not.
no,
Yeah, typically
I mean, we're
not.
basically paying for it out of general fund, I guess. or
Okay.
what have you.
So no. That's when you would look at local preference.
Okay.
Be like, did you invite a local vendor
Right.
to apply? Yeah. You had a question, Lisa?
No.
Okay. All right, so that's our micro purchase level. We continue on, and that again is on page 7. When we look at our service contracts, with the exception of A&E, and our purchase contracts between the thresholds of 10 and 90,000, you're in your small purchase. You're making a small purchase, and these particular protocols apply. This is where we go out for requests for quotes. You must be sure that you quote an adequate number of qualified sources. Adequate number is something that's not defined in UG, but your particular agency may define adequate. The city of Greenville defines adequate as 3. And so you may go out for requests for quotes and ensure that you obtain an adequate number of qualified resources. This is also the opportunity where we can solicit we can go through a formal bid process. And when I say formal, I don't mean formal in the sense of the procurement protocol, but formal in the sense of we're going to write out the specifications, because it's not feasible for us to call up a vendor and say, can you perform this service? You actually need to write out some specifications. Yes, the purchasing department can assist you with that, and we can post it on the website for a certain number of days to ensure that we get those qualified number of vendors. In that process, we definitely want to make certain that we are taking affirmative steps to include our MWBE firms. Also, we're going to award according to the LRRB award standard. And also, when we come to the requisition portion, we're going to make sure that we include the documents that are on page 7. That again is your decision matrix, that's your request for quote form, that's your SAM your SAM screenshot to ensure that the vendor is not federally debarred. All of these again are listed in your manual. Any questions on this? And this again is for your services and for your purchases. Moving forward, we're getting into, again, that most restrictive level because we're hitting the $90,000 mark. So we know that we're going to enter into what the state considers the formal bidding range. And here is where we have the opportunity to, and I corrected this yesterday, and of course it shows up today uncorrected. But hey, we're going to move forward because we have our procurement manual. If we look on page 8, Page 8 lists the exact procedures and protocols that are necessary for any of our formal service and purchase contracts that are $90K and above. This is where you have to provide complete specifications. This is where you have to formally advertise for at least 7 days. We're going to publicly advertise on the city's website. We're going to be certain to include our MWBEs. We're going to open those bids publicly, so we're going to have a public bid open. Those bids must be returned to us sealed, and we do have a minimum bid requirement. This is something different. Typically, we only have a minimum bid requirement on the construction side of the house, but there's also a minimum bid requirement for services and purchases on the UG side. We experienced this with our GTAP project, Lamont, when we had our furniture bid. We received 2 bids, even though one was unresponsive, we still received that 2 bid minimum. So the bid minimum is something that we certainly want to keep in mind. And the reason I bring this up again is because we know on the construction side of the house, sometimes we have to build in a re-advertisement into our timeline because we need to know, hey, if we want to get this done by this time, we have to allow for these exceptions. So we're going to have to start doing the same thing on the service and purchase side to allow for what if we have to rebid this. Okay, so I just want to bring that to your attention.
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
So just to make sure I understood correctly, I thought I understood you to say that unresponsive bids do count toward the bid minimum.
So for the construction side of the house, if it's unresponsive in that there's no bid bond, we know we can't count those. On the purchase and service side of the house, I do not have a state protocol that says that we can't count them as we can't count them in the 2 bid minimum. So what I would do is actually contact our granting agency and make sure that we can count it. Because that is a kind of a gray area. So we also understand that on the local side of the house, we have to get our governing board approval for any purchase contracts that are above $100,000. So again, keep that in mind when you're doing your procurement planning, that we do need to allot for getting on the council agenda and getting approved by city council. Service contracts that are $250,000 and above, they may use the competitive proposal or the RFP procedure that's on page 9. That more than likely is going to apply to your IT contracts. Even though you're purchasing a good, if you will, oftentimes there is training that goes with that. There is a service component that goes with that. So they have a particular RFP process for the purchase of those goods plus service. And so if that is the case and that's the procurement you're making, you would use the competitive proposal procedure, which we will go over shortly. Any questions? Now we're going to go over to the construction side of the house. For construction, and this is on page 10 of your manual, for the construction side, we're looking at construction and repair contracts that are $10,000 up to $250,000, and this is your small purchase procurement type. On this side of the house, you must make certain that you are going out for quotes and that you're obtaining quotes from an adequate number of qualified sources. You must make certain that you're including your MWBE firms. And of course, and as usual, our practice is to go the next step, which is to go through the sealed bid process, do a public bid opening. All of that is absolutely fine because that's even more restrictive than what's required. But here is what the minimum is. We are also going to ensure that we do that we award those contracts on a fixed price or not to exceed basis. A cost or price analysis is not required at this particular juncture. However, we know that we often will do a cost estimate. So that is perfectly fine. And I do encourage you to include it in your documentation. We are awarding that contract to the LRRB, the lowest responsible bidder. And we know that governing board approval is not required until you get up to the $300,000 mark, even though it is our practice at times to go before council when we deem it necessary. All of the records that must be attached, you will find it below on page 10, and it's listed there for you. We're including your MWBE documentation. Again, if it's over $100,000, we do include that on the local level. So please include that documentation if it's over $100,000. So that means the good faith effort evaluation that Ferdinand does, you will include that as well. Some of these forms are new to us and they were created specifically for UG. So for example, under letter F, you see a contractor reference verification worksheet. That was actually created so that we could have a standard form that we use when we contact references. That form can be edited. It can be nuanced, if you will, to fit your particular needs. Or you can use a form that you're using currently as long as it provides similar information. But I wanted to let you know that we do have some sample forms available that we will review at the end of the presentation. Moving right along. We're at the threshold now where we're in the most restrictive range. So again, when we're looking at construction contracts between $250,000 and $500,000, we're going to be continuing with the sealed bid method. We're going to make sure that we perform a cost or price analysis. We do have worksheets for that as well, but again, you can go ahead and use the method you've been using currently. Complete specifications must be made available to all the bidders. We're going to publicly advertise, put it on our City of Greenville website. We're going to include our MWBE documentation. The bids must be submitted sealed and open publicly. We have a minimum of 2 bids. But again, your particular agency may have a greater minimum. Again, this is just what UG is requiring. We are requiring the 5% bid bond and performance bond. Of course, it will be awarded on a fixed price basis. We're going to award to the lowest responsive bidder. And of course, governing board approval is required at the $300,000 level. If we look at page 11 of our manual, you will see the laundry list here of all of the forms that we're asking you to include with your particular requisition or your contract to ensure that we can document that we did what we know we need to do. All right, we're in the short rows now.
I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
So, and I guess it will apply to both of these.
Do we need to go back?
No, you
Okay.
actually have it here in number 6. I just
Okay.
wanted to verify the minimum of 2 bids.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a change from what we've dealt with historically.
For
correct?
construction.
Because we've always had to have a minimum of 3 bids, which is why we built in the re-advertisement into our schedule.
Absolutely.
So I just want to make sure that I'm seeing and understanding that correctly.
Absolutely. Can you send me a note after the class via email so I can go back and verify that with the School of Government? You're exactly right. If we're going by the most restrictive rule, I would say 3 bids would be your
Right.
minimum. So please send me a note to remind me, because my pen is not handy. And that way I can verify that with the School of Government. And I'll update the policy if necessary.
Okay. One other question.
Mm-hmm.
On the 5% bid bond,
Mhm.
historically, we've had an either or 5% bid bond or certified check in the amount of 5% of the
Mhm.
bid. Is that still allowable, or is it now only 5% bid bond?
So I would say that your certified check is allowable, but please put that in your note again, because that's a great question,
Okay.
and I'll verify that.
Okay.
All right?
We've also had some discussions regarding the opening of,
Mhm.
if you didn't receive the minimum number of bids, being able to
Open them. Mm-hmm.
Does that play at all? I mean, is there any difference now that?
There is no difference. Mm-mm. There's no difference. We can still handle it the same way, whether you choose to open them or give it back to the vendor or hold them.
Okay.
They still have the same choices. The bidder does.
Just to clarify too, Denise,
Mhm.
this, under this category in the manual itself,
Mm-hmm.
number 6, it says 2 bids,
Mhm.
and the manual says 3.
It does say 3.
It
Okay.
does, under this category.
Under this
So
category.
if you go back to your previous slide,
Right.
Uh-huh.
it says 2 bids in the manual, so
Yeah.
you might still want to verify that one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'll do that.
Okay.
I'll do that. Make sure it's consistent.
Mhm.
Sounds good.
It's now 5.
Any additional questions? Okay. All right, so we're at the $500,000 level. This information is substantially the same as the previous slide, but again, we'll check on the minimum number of bids, and we'll also check on the bid bond information. So now let's move on to our A&E design services. Under design services, we have the opportunity to look at the Minnie Brooks Act, and we know that under state regulations and state laws, Minnie Brooks is required at all levels, so that's the most restrictive rule. So we are going to issue an RFQ. We are going to ensure that we're making affirmative steps to include MWBE vendors. We are going to include our MWBE documentation. We are going to evaluate qualifications, not based on price. We're going to have the opportunity to rank those respondents and make sure that we select the best qualified and then negotiate from there. So our process is going to be substantially the same as our current process when it comes to our RFQ contracts. And the actual list of records or documentation that is necessary to include is on page 13 of our manual. And you'll see something about a decision matrix. What we've done with the purchasing division is we've actually created a template decision matrix in Excel that will actually tally all of your evaluators and their scores. It does give you some sample criterion that you can look at. But of course, you do not have to use this decision matrix, nor do you have to use the criteria that we're looking at. This is just to kind of get you started, perhaps if you've not done the process before, or if you'd like to see some additional examples.
Question.
Mhm.
On the decision matrix, we've done those before ourselves.
Yeah.
Is that, the one that you have,
Mhm.
is that editable? I guess,
Absolutely.
For our particular, based upon the, I guess, what we're looking for in that particular.
Yes,
for that.
yes. You would just have to save it as a new document,
Okay.
and you can edit it as you choose. Yes.
Item 5 under, on page 13, talks about preference may be given to in-state but not local firms. The previous guidance, this says just anything under 250,000. The previous guidance, I think 50,000 and under, we had local preference that did apply. So are we following the most restrictive, that under 50,000 it will still apply, or how will that work?
So because UG prohibits geographic preference for everything, we cannot use local preference at all.
Okay.
So we are going to follow the UG guidance, and this is actually a state law, so far as being able to give preference to in-state firms. So I verified this before I put it in the manual with the School of Government, and this is verbatim what they've given us for guidance. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So that ruling that City Council made, I guess, several years ago, that's invalid.
When you say the ruling, help me.
Well, when the whole local preference policy came out several years ago.
Sure.
And was, I guess, voted upon by council.
Absolutely. So, yes, our local policy applies to, and actually it's stated in our policy, it applies where it can be applied. And it actually references grants as where there may be an exception.
Okay.
So this would be that exception.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So it's still relative on local funds.
It is,
So-
on local funds. Mm-hmm. I see his wheels turning, so I'm waiting.
There's another question, but you've already answered it.
Okay, very good. I love questions, y'all, and questions are good because when you get it all out in the open, then everyone hears the answer, so everyone can benefit. So very good. Okay, so under the purchase requirements for $250,000 or more, here the only difference is public advertisement. We know that under our state law, we only have to announce RFQs. We don't have to publicly advertise them. UG is saying that you have to advertise. So that's going to be a change for us. So anything that's $250,000 and above, it must be publicly advertised. And that is the substantial difference between below 250 and above 250.
So the competitive proposal procedure, it was a little confusing for me because, like you said, always in the past we've had to follow Minnie Brooks. Minnie Brooks still applies.
Yes.
Regardless of dollar amount.
Minnie Brooks still applies. And so there is a difference between the competitive proposal procedure and this procedure of Minnie Brooks in this instance because we're looking at design services. So if you were doing a competitive proposal for a purchase contract or a service contract, then we would follow that procedure.
Right.
But this is a competitive proposal that's under the design services contract, so Minnie Brooks is going to apply.
Okay.
So essentially the difference between an RFP and an RFQ.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Another question. And I think, well, no, it wasn't under, so under 4.11 in the manual, items 4 and 6, I have a question about how they are different. Item 4 says identify the evaluation criteria and relevant importance of each criteria in the RFQ, and then it talks about must have a written method for conducting technical evaluations of proposals and selecting the best qualified firm. So I would think that the evaluation criteria really already explains that. So I guess I'm really looking maybe for some clarification on the written method of conducting evaluations.
Sure. So the guidance says that you should have a written method. So that means, let's say, for example, you do have your evaluation criteria as it states in number 4, and you're saying the relative importance is that each of them are weighted equally. So if it's a percentage, do you require your evaluators to give you a number of 1 through 5 that then converts to a percent that you're going to roll up into an overall score and you're going to take the average? Or is it going to be we're going to have each evaluator give us our score, and then we're going to come back to the table and look at the top 2, and then we're going to, go across the table and see, do you still agree with this score, understanding the input from your colleague across from the table. So that could change.
Okay, very good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Any additional questions? Okay. All right, so we've gone over the major differences for 1 through 4, and then also for number 7, and now we're going to look at the bidding exceptions, which includes your sole source information. So under your sole source information, essentially what you need to know is that unless your granting agency states that you can sole source something, you can't. But these are the instances where they may allow you to do it. I get a lot of questions about state contract because we know under the state rules and state laws, state contracts are considered a competitive bid exception. So if we purchase something off a state contract using local funds, we do not have to competitively bid it. That is not the case for federal guidelines. The only time you have an exception to the competitive bid statute under the federal guidelines is if you're using a federal contract. So that would be GSA or an interlocal agreement. Okay, so just keep that in mind. A lot of times your state contracts will not be an exception. You can definitely use a vendor that is on state contract, but you're looking at their price. That's essentially how you're evaluating them.
How about proprietary equipment or actually even the services?
Absolutely. So if you are going to your granting agency, they're going to ask you for a justification. So when you come up with your justification, if you look on page 15 of the manual, it's giving you some ideas of the content that you can put in your write-up. And under that content, you can say things like, well, this is a piece of equipment that's proprietary, and we need to use this particular equipment for this reason. And so again, if they agree with your justification, they will possibly allow you to move forward with that sole source.
And as well, it might also, the sole source too is maybe equipment that we are currently using and want to stay consistent with.
Mm-hmm. So that's
still in the, basically you provide that in justification?
That is definitely a justification that's allowed under the state regulations. I cannot say that will be allowed under the federal regulations. So that's something to think about and consider.
What type of authorization is required? Do we need some sort of written
Something in writing.
notice, or?
It can be an email as long as it includes the if you will, byline of your representative with that agency. I will accept that. But again, keep that in mind when you're doing your procurement planning. So if you're anticipating that you want to do a sole source, go ahead and get that authorization.
Of the Buy America as well, that comes into play. It did with GTAC.
Okay.
And the way it was bid, they were given, the contractor was given kind of or equal things but yet part of the contract said, or one portion of the contract said that it had to be all Buy America.
Mm-hmm.
But the examples that were provided in specifications were not necessarily all American. So we got into a situation, but with that.
Mm-hmm. Understood. So you have to comply with both.
I'm sorry?
So you're trying to comply with both.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you have to comply with Buy America.
Yeah.
Yeah, or at least say that you are going to comply with it or not. Mm-hmm. I gotcha. There are definitely nuances to this thing, and the more complex your procurements become, the more layered your evaluation has to be as far as compliance and so on and so forth. Very good. Great questions. This concludes the the presentation form. I would like to take an opportunity to go through the individual manuals, but before I do that, I just want to say thank you all for your attendance, and of course, we will ask you to complete the conflict of interest statement before you leave today. Thank you.